There is something about Canada in the 1990s that people who lived through it cannot forget. The dial-up internet, the referendum that nearly split the country, the explosion of Canadian music on the world stage. If someone grew up then, they know exactly what made that decade so distinctive. This was a time when Canada was navigating its identity through constitutional crises while embracing the digital revolution. Alanis Morissette was topping charts worldwide. The internet was transforming how Canadians communicated. The Toronto Raptors and Vancouver Grizzlies brought NBA basketball to Canada. This was the decade that gave us the goods and services tax, the Quebec referendum of 1995, NAFTA, and the birth of the World Wide Web at Canadian universities. Grunge replaced the big hair of the 1980s. Flannel shirts became a uniform. Being Canadian meant watching the country modernize rapidly, while old political divisions threatened to tear it apart. Let's walk through what daily life actually felt like during that transformative decade. Some of this might bring back memories. Some of it reveals how much changed in just 10 years. Let's step into that world. Homes in Canada in the 1990s were shedding the pastels of the 1980s. The mauve and dusty rose were out. Neutral tones were in. Beige, taupe, cream, and sage green covered walls. The goal was a cleaner, simpler look. Oak-key cabinets dominated kitchens, often with that distinctive golden honey finish. Countertops were laminate, frequently in almond or white. Granite countertops started appearing in upscale homes by the late 1990s, signaling wealth. Berber carpet replaced the plush carpets of the 1980s. This low-pile, neutral carpet was practical and modern-looking. Hardwood floors were being refinished as people moved away from wall-to-wall carpeting. The entertainment center remained the focal point of living rooms, but it was growing. These massive oak or black laminate units had to accommodate the television, VCR, stereo system, and by the late 1990s, a DVD player. Televisions were getting bigger. A 32-inch screen was impressive. Rear projection televisions were the ultimate status symbol, despite taking up enormous space. The cordless phone was standard, but homes now had multiple handsets. Caller ID appeared in the middle of the decade, fundamentally changing how people answered their phones. Screening calls became possible. Answering machines with small cassette tapes recorded messages. Families would rush home to check the blinking light. Computers started appearing in more Canadian homes throughout the 1990s. Early in the decade, they were expensive and primarily used for simple tasks and games. By the late 1990s, they were becoming essential. Families would set up the computer in a spare room or in a corner of the living room. The beige tower sat on the floor, and the CRT monitor sat on the desk, taking up significant space. The dial-up modem became the sound of the decade. That screeching, buzzing connection noise is burned into the memory of anyone who was online in the 1990s. Connecting to the internet meant tying up the phone line. If someone picked up the phone, they would disconnect you instantly. Arguments over internet time versus phone calls were constant in households. Internet service providers like Simpatico, Sprint, and later Rogers competed for customers. By the late 1990s, email addresses were becoming common. Hotmail and Yahoo Mail offered free email. People would check their email once a day, excited to see new messages. The 1990s brought major political moments that defined Canada. The failure of the Meech Lake Accord in 1990 and the Charlottetown Accord in 1992 left constitutional tensions unresolved. Quebec's place in Canada remained uncertain. The 1995 Quebec referendum nearly tore the country apart. On October 30th, 1995, Quebecers voted on whether to separate from Canada. The vote was breathtakingly close. The no side won with only 50.58% of the vote. A margin of just 54,288 votes kept Canada together. For Canadians watching the results that night, it was terrifying. The country could have split. In Quebec, families were divided. Friendships were strained. The emotional toll was enormous. The aftermath left deep scars. Federalists felt relief but also recognized how close they had come to losing. Sovereignists felt devastated, knowing they had come so close. The goods and services tax, the GST, was introduced in 1991 at 7%. Canadians hated it. A new tax on almost everything felt like a betrayal, especially during a recession. The progressive conservative government that introduced it was nearly wiped out in the 1993 election, reduced to just 2 seats. The economy struggled in the early 1990s. Recession hit in 1990 and lasted into the mid-decade. Unemployment was high. Interest rates had been crushing in the late 1980s, and many people lost homes. Manufacturing continued to decline. The Canada-US Free Trade Agreement took effect in 1989, and NAFTA expanded it in 1994 to include Mexico. These trade deals were controversial. Supporters said they would create jobs and growth. Opponents feared Canadian jobs would move south. By the late 1990s, the economy recovered strongly. The tech boom was creating wealth. Nortel became a Canadian success story, its stock price soaring. Everyone seemed to know someone working in tech. Before we continue with the music and culture that exploded onto the world stage, if you are enjoying these glimpses into Canadian history and want to explore more decades and stories from the past, consider subscribing. There is so much more to uncover about how Canadians lived and built the country we know today. Canadian music in the 1990s conquered the world. After decades of being known primarily domestically, Canadian artists became international superstars. Alanis Morissette released Jagged Little Pill in 1995. The album sold over 33 million copies worldwide. Songs like You Oughta Know and Ironic made her one of the biggest artists on the planet. Her raw, emotional style felt revolutionary. Celine Dion was already successful, but the 1990s made her a global icon. My Heart Will Go On from Titanic became one of the best-selling singles of all time. Her Las Vegas residencies and international tours made her one of the most recognized Canadians in the world. Shania Twain brought country pop to mainstream success. Come On Over, released in 1997, became the best-selling album by a female artist in any genre. Her crossover success was unprecedented for a Canadian country artist. The Tragically Hip remained the band that defined Canadian identity. Their music was everywhere in Canada, but remained largely unknown in the United States. This made them even more beloved at home. Seeing the Hip live became a rite of passage for Canadian teenagers. Bare Naked Ladies broke through with 1 Week in 1998. Sarah McLachlan founded Lilith Fair in 1997, showcasing female artists. Our Lady Peace, I Mother Earth, and Sloan represented Canadian alternative rock. The Smashing Pumpkins frontman Billy Corgan was Canadian-American, but bands like Moist and Matthew Good Band were purely Canadian. Much Music continued to dominate Canadian youth culture. The VJS were celebrities. The Much Music Video Awards were essential viewing. The channel played a mix of Canadian and international artists, and Canadian content rules meant domestic artists got significant airplay. Grunge had a massive impact on Canadian youth in the early 1990s. Flannel shirts, ripped jeans, and Doc Martens became the uniform. The polished look of the 1980s was rejected completely. Hip-hop was growing in influence. Canadian hip-hop artists like Maestro Fresh West and Dream Warriors were building the scene. Much Music introduced Rap City, dedicated to hip-hop videos. Shopping in the 1990s in Canada was changing rapidly. Big-box American retailers invaded Canada. Walmart crossed the border by acquiring Woolco stores in 1994. The familiar blue and yellow signs replaced Canadian institutions. Prices were lower than traditional department stores. Canadian retailers struggled to compete. Costco opened warehouses across Canada. The concept of buying in bulk appealed to families. The free samples on weekends became a Canadian Saturday tradition. Home Depot and Lowe's brought big box home improvement retail. Canadian Tire faced new competition. Chapters became the dominant bookstore chain, creating massive stores with coffee shops. Browsing for hours became a weekend activity. Eaton's, the once mighty department store, declared bankruptcy in 1999. It was the end of an ERA. The store that had defined Canadian retail for over a century was gone. The Bay remained, but shopping malls were facing challenges. Malls were still social spaces, especially for teenagers. The food court was where everyone gathered. Arcades in malls drew crowds until home gaming systems improved. Tim Hortons expanded aggressively throughout the 1990s. The chain became even more central to Canadian identity. The roll-up-the-rim contest remained a spring tradition. Double-double entered the Canadian vocabulary. A Tim Hortons in every town became the goal, and the company largely achieved it. Television in the 1990s offered more choice than ever before. Cable was standard in most homes. Dozens of channels meant something was always on. The Simpsons dominated Sunday nights. Seinfeld and Friends were cultural phenomena. Canadians watched the same American shows as everyone else, and Canadian content was also thriving. Due South, about a Mountie in Chicago, ran from 1994 to 1999. The show played with Canadian stereotypes, and it was genuinely entertaining. Kids in the Hall brought absurdist sketch comedy with a uniquely Canadian sensibility. This hour has 22 minutes provided political satire. The Royal Canadian Air Force continued its long run. These shows proved Canadian comedy could hold its own. Degrassi. The Next Generation launched in 2001, but it built on the success in the 1990s of Degrassi Junior High and Degrassi High. The franchise remained distinctly Canadian in dealing honestly with teen issues. YTV was essential for Canadian kids. The Zone After School featured hosts introducing cartoons and other shows. Sailor Moon, Dragon Ball Z, and Pokemon were massive. Pokemon cards became an obsession. Kids traded them at school, and parents lined up at stores to buy packs. The schoolyard economy ran on Pokemon. The Simpsons, The X-Files, and ER were the water cooler shows. Missing an episode meant being left out of conversations. VCRS allowed recording, but programming them remained a mystery to many parents. Blockbuster Video dominated movie rentals. Friday nights often meant going to Blockbuster, hoping the new releases were available. Late fees were dreaded. The Nintendo Entertainment System gave way to Super Nintendo in the early 1990s. Sega Genesis competed aggressively. The 16-bit wars were real. Kids picked sides. By the mid-1990s, Sony PlayStation changed everything. The graphics were revolutionary. Games like Final Fantasy VII and Metal Gear Solid were immersive experiences unlike anything before. Nintendo 64 launched in 1996. GoldenEye 007 became the game everyone played. 4-player split-screen gaming meant friends gathering for hours. The Game Boy remained popular throughout the decade. Game Boy Color launched in 1998, extending its dominance. Kids played Pokemon Red and Blue obsessively, training teams and trading Pokemon using link cables. Childhood in the 1990s in Canada was the last generation before smartphones and social media dominated everything. Kids still played outside extensively. They played street hockey, biked around neighborhoods, and built forts. The freedom was significant. Slap bracelets were banned in many schools. Pogs were collected and played with obsessively until the fad died. Tamagotchis required constant attention. These digital pets would die if neglected, causing genuine distress. Chat rooms and instant messaging appeared in the late 1990s. ICQ and later MSN Messenger changed how teenagers communicated. Away messages became an art form. Canadian kids grew up with both metric and imperial measurements. Officially, Canada was metric, but many older Canadians still used imperial, knowing both systems was necessary. Weather was given in degrees Celsius, but height was in feet and inches. Hockey remained the dominant sport. The Montreal Canadiens won the Stanley Cup in 1993, the last Canadian team to do so. That fact would become increasingly painful as the years passed. The Toronto Maple Leafs remained beloved despite not winning since 1967. Wayne Gretzky retired in 1999, ending what many call the greatest hockey career ever. His final game was emotional for the entire country. The Toronto Raptors and Vancouver Grizzlies joined the NBA in 1995. Basketball was growing in Canada. The Raptors struggled initially, but they brought real excitement to cities across the country. The Blue Jays won back-to-back World Series in 1992 and 1993. Joe Carter's walk-off home run in 1993 is one of the greatest moments in Canadian sports history. Donovan Bailey won gold in the 100 meters at the 1996 Olympics, setting a world record. Canadian pride swelled. What defined Canada in the 1990s was transformation. The country survived its closest brush with separation. The economy moved from recession to boom. The internet changed how people communicated and worked. Canadian artists achieved unprecedented international success. The decade brought challenges. Constitutional uncertainty and economic struggles marked the early years, but it also brought growing confidence. Canada was modern, multicultural, and connected to the world in new ways. For those who lived through it, the 1990s were flannel shirts and dial-up modems, Pokemon cards, and much music, a referendum night that held the nation's breath, Alanis Morissette on repeat, the sound of a dial-up connection, and Tim Hortons becoming even more essential. Canada in the 1990s was finding its place in a globalizing world while maintaining its distinct identity. For those with memories of this dynamic era, there is always more history to explore.